Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight, live from Warsaw. European leaders met for an emergency summit on the continent's security and war in Ukraine. The meeting was called by French President Emmanuel Macron in Paris, with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk in attendance. More on that in a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Poland says it will not send troops to Ukraine. Key talks between the United States and Russia over the war in Ukraine are set to begin on Tuesday. Better NI and a data center. Microsoft is set to invest $700 million in Poland. Poland's Prime Minister says the country is ruling out sending its troops to Ukraine. He also spoke out against a non-NATO European defense alliance as the US pushes to sideline the continent in peace negotiations over Ukraine. Meanwhile, American officials prepare to sit down with their Russian counterparts in Saudi Arabia. And our chief political correspondent, Aaron Damon, is in Paris following the events at today's emergency summit. Good evening, Aaron. So what do we know any details of this urgent meeting?
Good evening, Maciej. That is the million-dollar question, and we are still waiting on concrete details from the summit today. But one thing is for sure, Europe has felt the shock. Now it is scrambling to act. French President Emmanuel Macron convening this summit as America seemingly looks to freeze Europe out of Ukraine peace negotiations. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, he's here, so too are leaders from Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, and indeed from Brussels. We've learned that French President Macron had a phone call with President Trump just moments before he welcomed leaders to the Elysee Palace. We're hearing that conversation, unsurprisingly, was frank. And as you mentioned there, remember tomorrow, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be in Saudi Arabia meeting directly with Russian officials. We've just stepped out from a Prime Minister Donald Tusk press conference, and today he's ruled out sending Polish troops into Ukraine and poured cold water on a defence force outside of the NATO framework. It was Volodymyr Zelenskyy who suggested a European army at the Munich Security Conference over the weekend. Donald Tusk does not seem keen on that. He's also noted that, quote, if we Europeans fail to spend big on defence now, we will be forced to spend 10 times more if we don't prevent a wider war. And here to break down this very developing story is TVP World Europe editor Marcin Zaborowski. Marcin, has Europe been caught off guard by the US?
Well, we really have a classic situation here of not being invited to the dinner, but being on the menu. Essentially what happened here is that the Russians and the Americans have agreed to certain parameters of the agreement. We know that Ukraine will be losing territory, it will not recapture its territory, and the Americans would not help Ukraine to recapture its territory. We also know that Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO, and it will be in some sort of a security gray zone. In order to keep that functioning, in order to keep that peace agreement at all possible, it will be the European troops which are meant to guarantee the security of Ukraine. So Europeans are no longer here in the game of actually, is it a good agreement, is it not a good agreement, but Europeans are in the game, will you provide troops, will you send money, will you provide Ukraine with resources so it can function as a state?
Marcin, we've been in Munich for the security conference. Now we're here in Paris for this emergency summit. What's next?
Well, I think that what we will be seeing next will be declarations from various European leaders, whether they actually recognize this game, whether they think it is a good and fair game, whether they will contribute troops and resources to make the plan which was devised by Americans and the Russians workable. And we already see the British Prime Minister saying, yes, we will send troops to Ukraine, we can do that. The Swedes are considering doing that. The Polish Prime Minister is saying a different thing. The Polish Prime Minister is saying, I'm not sure about this agreement. We want to support Ukraine. Nobody supports Ukraine as much as we do, but we are not ready to send Polish troops to Ukraine.
TVP World Europe editor Marcin Zaborowski. And Maciej, watch this space because the stakes here could not be higher.
Couldn't agree any more. That was Aaron Damon reporting from Paris. Thank you very much, both of you, gentlemen. Analysts are warning that Europe could find itself unprepared, underpowered and vulnerable unless it takes action now to boost its defences. This is also one of the topics dominating today's European Security Summit in Paris, as the EU fears that America could reduce its presence on the continent at a time when European governments may be called on to deploy thousands of troops as part of a possible peacekeeping force in Ukraine. John Todd has this report.
Soldiers on the streets of Stockholm, participating in the city's largest military exercise. Sweden's Prime Minister says it's troops like these that could be deployed in any peacekeeping force that emerges from talks to stop the war in Ukraine.
Sweden, we are normally a part of strengthening security in our part of the world, so I foresee us to be a part of that this time as well.
His comments come after the British Prime Minister said the UK was ready to send troops to Ukraine as part of a peace deal.
By that I mean playing our full part when it comes to the defence of the sovereignty of Ukraine if there's a peace agreement, and of course when it comes to funding and training. So on all those fronts I want the UK and all European allies to step up and for the UK to play a leading part in that.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy suggested that it could take up to 100,000 troops to secure the current 1,300-kilometre front line, a tally Europe would struggle to muster. Experts say if US President Donald Trump succeeds in ending Russia's war in Ukraine, his attention will turn elsewhere, and Europe must step up to protect itself.
Once he finishes this war, it will be Europe's only interest and it will be Europe's only burden to deal with peace in Ukraine.
It's actually the right thing to do, and it will be difficult or challenging for the Europeans, but we and the European representatives need to find a way how to do this. Otherwise, it's going to be still in the hands of the US, and we don't know what is exactly the position and how reliable they will be in a position like that.
Trump is looking to secure rights to rare earth minerals in exchange for the billions the US is investing in protecting Ukraine. Experts suggest, though, that it's unlikely US firms would work in the field without some form of American protection.
It seems strange, to be present, have its own presence with American companies in Ukraine without the cover or protection of United States. Maybe United States troops.
While discussions continue, Poland on Monday ruled out deploying troops to Ukraine. Prime Minister Donald Tusk said the security assurances for Ukraine and the inviolability of its borders must result from cooperation between the EU, the US and NATO.
Poland will support Ukraine as it has done so far, organizationally, in accordance with our financial capabilities. In terms of humanitarian and military aid, we do not anticipate sending Polish soldiers to Ukraine.
Sweden's neighbour Denmark says it's too early to discuss sending Danish troops to Ukraine, a position also reflected by Berlin. As the peace plan gathers pace, they may soon have to make a decision.
And how do Ukrainians approach the idea of placing peacekeeping force on their territory? Our correspondent Don Arlett has more straight from Kyiv.
Keir Starmer announcing that he would put UK troops in harm's way here in Ukraine to embark upon some type of peacekeeping mission. Of course, EU leaders will be discussing who will participate in such a meeting in Paris during those talks with EU leaders. Now, here in Ukraine, the idea of this notion, actually the devil is in the details. And so declarations from the United Kingdom and from other countries in Europe that they wish to participate in such a mission, it really depends on the scope of such a mission. I spoke to Mikhailo Samus earlier today, a defense expert, and we had a lengthy discussion about what the perspective is here in Ukraine, and here's what he told me.
If you're talking about any peacekeeping or stabilization forces, it should be agreement between both sides. I mean that Ukraine and Russia, and because it's a principle of peacekeeping. Both sides of the conflict needs to say yes. We allow to forces to be in demilitarized zone or any possible areas to stop the violence. But this is not a normal conflict. It's a real high-intensity war. So any participation of any troops on any zone of stabilization is really to have agreement, strong agreement, of course, on the guarantees of United States.
So, of course, one of the, I guess, key factors here is that both sides are going to have to agree to have peacekeepers on the ground here. So that means Russia will have to sign off on that as well. The other issues are the rules of engagement. So we are a long way away from there. First, talks need to be had, and obviously that is not going to happen overnight. Also, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has announced on his Telegram channel that EU commissioners will come to Kyiv and visit the country next week in a sign of solidarity. Of course, they will discuss security and defense, tightening sanctions on Russia, economic cooperation, as well as EU integration. EU integration being a top priority for Kyiv right now. Reporting from Kyiv, Don Arleth, TVP World.
The Middle East has become the stage of negotiations over the war in Ukraine. As U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is scheduled to hold peace talks with Russia's delegates in Saudi Arabia, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is negotiating an exchange of prisoners with Russia in the United Arab Emirates. Sonia Gatabishchan has more.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has arrived in the United Arab Emirates. Aside from economic and humanitarian considerations, his top priority was the exchange of prisoners. The UAE has mediated 12 prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, resulting in the release of roughly 2,800 individuals. And Zelenskyy hopes the practice will evolve further.
I would like the United Arab Emirates president to try and increase the number of prisoners exchanges and prisoners to be released.
At the same time, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Saudi Arabia. Joined by National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, Rubio is expected to hold talks on Tuesday with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Kremlin Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine.
Do you expect Zelenskyy to be involved in these conversations? What will his role be?
I do. He will be involved, yes.
But Zelenskyy argues that Ukraine was never invited.
Ukraine did not know anything about it. Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as ones that have no result, and we cannot recognize any things, any agreements about us without us, and we will not recognize such agreements.
Ukrainian president is also heading to Saudi Arabia on Tuesday, but he emphasized his visit has nothing to do with the planned exchanges between the US and Russia. Notwithstanding, the region has proven to be a practical mediation hub.
In the Middle East is seen pretty much as a neutral ground by both parties, and where such meetings took place.
The visits followed the Munich Security Conference, which left Europe taken aback by the remarks of the US Vice President, who alleged that Europe's biggest threat is its loss of fundamental values.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within.
This becomes difficult.
We have seen head of Munich Security Conference, Heusgen, crying publicly because J.D. Vance has been so cruel on him in his speech. But we have never seen Mr. Heusgen crying publicly because of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians.
The Munich conference also set off shockwaves after U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, asserted that Europe would not have a seat at the table in Ukraine peace talks.
There are calls for saying that this was actually the wake-up call. Munich was the wake-up call. But we listened to these wake-up calls for at least 3 years right now.
Kellogg is scheduled to meet Polish President Andrzej Duda on Tuesday and travel to Ukraine later in the week. Zelenskyy said he hopes the U.S. Special Envoy will visit the front line with him.
Again in Saudi Arabia, the Kremlin is intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian towns and cities. Russia launched a series of drone and artillery attacks across Ukraine over the past 24 hours, killing 3 civilians and injuring 8 others. Our Ukraine correspondent, Os Kateji, joins us now live from Kyiv with more. Good evening, Os. What more can you tell us about the recent situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, a widespread attack across Ukraine overnight by the Russian armed forces, with the Ukrainian Air Force reporting 147 drones were launched by Russia across the territory of Ukraine, with 83 of those being intercepted. 2 people were killed in Donetsk from artillery shelling and 1 person was killed in Nikopol from a drone strike. Now, as I said, this was a widespread attack targeting Kharkiv, Sumy, Poltava, Dnipropetrovsk, Cherski, Chernihiv, Odessa, Kirovohrad, Zaporizhia, and Kyiv, with some damage. In Kyiv, reported fire in at least 4 separate residential buildings, damage from falling debris from intercepted drone fire. So a really, really busy night for the Ukrainian Air Force. Shows that whatever is going on the sidelines when it comes to negotiations, the daily reality here in Ukraine is still constant aerial bombardment from Russia.
That was Os Kateji reporting from Kyiv. Thank you, Os. Stay safe. Microsoft has announced plans to invest an additional $700 million in Poland to develop its data center, increase its computing capabilities and boost AI growth. TVP World's Paweł Trzaskowski has more details.
Microsoft plans to spend around $700 million in Poland in the next 2 years to develop the computing capabilities of its already existing data center. This investment, in light of the recent developments of American-European relations, is believed to be a sign of trust for Poland.
This investment by Microsoft represents an enormous vote of confidence.
Today's announcement from Microsoft confirms Poland's very strong position in relations with our allies, especially the United States.
These increased computing capabilities will be mostly used to develop AI, especially in the field of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity that is believed to be crucial to protect the country during the election from foreign malign interference.
One of the, I think, really important uses of technology is to protect political campaigns, to protect politicians, to protect voting, and to protect the electorate.
Microsoft's Monday announcement comes just days after another major investment was revealed by Google. Both investments that are believed by experts to be a clear sign that Poland is currently at the forefront when it comes to IT development. From Warsaw, Poland, for TVP World, I'm Paweł Trzaskowski.
As peace negotiations between the US and Russia over the war in Ukraine are set to begin in Saudi Arabia, Europe scrambles to secure its position by ramping up defense spending, and Ukraine is left in disbelief as Washington has not invited its representatives to join the talks with Moscow. And to discuss all this and more, we're joined by Kurt Volker, a former US ambassador to NATO and former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations under the previous Trump administration. Good evening.
Good evening. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you with us. So what is the American vision of peace in Ukraine, and what could be the role of Europe after a ceasefire is reached?
Well, I'll simplify it. We hear a lot of things from different American spokespeople right now, but if I could take a step back, I think it's 3 things. I think it's a ceasefire, deterrence against future Russian attacks, and burden sharing so that European allies do more. The rest is a lot of detail that I don't think President Trump is focused on yet. I think that there's a lot of pieces that are unknown, and the first piece that's unknown is whether Vladimir Putin can even be brought to a table and he can even agree to a ceasefire. And I think that's what Marco Rubio and the delegation are trying to figure out in Saudi Arabia. Is there any realistic prospect of Putin stopping this war?
So far, it seems that Vladimir Putin is quite eager to enter negotiations with the US. However, you said there were 3 points of this peace plan, and the second one is deterrence.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about it?
So the ceasefire is just getting both sides to stop where they are. That's not a permanent peace. That's an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to reload and plan the next attack. And so what we have to do as the West is act more swiftly to make it too costly for Putin to do that again. And this is what I think the European leaders in Paris should be talking about, is how does Europe contribute to a security set of assurances for Ukraine and a security presence in Ukraine that will contribute to Vladimir Putin making that call? And if they need backup or enablers from the United States, what are those? And let's get into that conversation.
So mainly European troops on the ground in Ukraine with some sort of backing from the US.
That's what I think is where this is going. Obviously, President Trump and Marco Rubio have not put that on the table yet, but I think anyone who knows the military capabilities of Europe and the United States and what would be convincing to Putin would see you've got to have some U.S. commitment to this, even though it should be European-led.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he sees no clear American plan for peace in Ukraine. And, well, we've also heard some very contradictory statements from the representatives of the U.S. administration over the past few days. So do you think that the whole Trump team knows where are they heading?
No, they don't. There is no plan. They're listening and testing. They're talking to Zelenskyy, they're talking with this Russian delegation, they're talking with allies in Europe, they're seeing what comes out of this Paris meeting. If we had come up with a plan, if the United States had come up with a plan, then people would complain that we came up with a plan without them. And so now they're complaining that we don't have a plan. But what they're trying to do is get a lay of the land and see whether it's actually possible to get an end to the fighting.
Donald Trump says he believes Vladimir Putin would like to end the war in Ukraine swiftly, and on the other hand does not believe Volodymyr Zelenskyy when he says that Putin is readying Russia for a future attack on the eastern flank of NATO. Now, is Putin a more reliable partner for Donald Trump than Volodymyr Zelenskyy?
I would say just because Donald Trump said that doesn't mean it's what he's thinking. I think what he's doing is trying to convince Putin to engage. Say, okay, we're ready to engage with you to stop this war. The reality is that I think President Trump knows full well that President Putin wants to take him for a ride, and he's watching and waiting and seeing how this goes. With Zelenskyy, it seems to me that President Trump's view, but I could be wrong, it seems to me his view is that we have done a lot for Ukraine in terms of providing military assistance and financial assistance and humanitarian aid. And he wants to now strike a transactional deal with Ukraine. So we'll help you, we want to help you, but you've got to pay us back somehow. So that's where this whole mineral deal thing came from. I know members in Congress are looking at a loan package for Ukraine rather than aid so that it would be paid back someday like the British did. So I think that's where that is going on the U.S.-Ukraine side. And meanwhile, I think we don't have any commitment from Russia to stop the war at this moment. So he's trying to find a way if we can get to that.
The American and Russian teams of negotiators are to discuss more than just peace in Ukraine. The announcement said the aim of the meeting is to restore good mutual relations. So what else is there on the table? And could Donald Trump maybe be looking to somehow lure Russia out of the Chinese sphere?
I do think that is probably something in the minds of some people in the U.S. is to divide Russia and China. I think, however, that this is more a Russian interest, that they want to put on the table a bunch of other things in order to distract us and get us focused on, whether it's arms control or whether it's Iran or whether it's North Korea, or get a whole bunch of other things out there so we take our eye off the ball of the ceasefire. And I hope that the delegation in Saudi Arabia, I expect the delegation there, they're going to listen to the Russians, they're going to not make any commitments, they're going to come back and talk with President Trump. But I think they'll get a clearer sense of how the Russians are playing this.
Now, relations between EU and the US, especially after the last weekend's summit, are strained, to say the least, especially after J.D. Vance's remarks on democracy in Europe. Therefore, could Europe turn to China? It's in an attempt to boost its security, as well. The EU is clearly not being treated as an equal partner for the US.
And somehow people think China will treat them better. I mean, this is laughable.
It's just looking for a bigger partner.
Yeah, this is a pathetic statement about Europe, that Europe feels it needs a partner somewhere to protect them, and that therefore they have to turn somewhere, and that somewhere is China. That's just pathetic. Europe should be developing its own vision, its own goals, its own capabilities, and making its own decisions about what it wants to do on the European continent. And that's something the United States has been urging for a long time. And it's unfortunate that something like J.D. Vance's speech, which was much more about political philosophy of democracy than about anything else, that is the catalyst that gets Europeans upset and resentful. So now they actually are meeting in Paris to talk about what their goal is. So wrong reason, but good response.
Mm-hmm. European leaders are in fact meeting today in Paris, and Keith Kellogg's special U.S. envoy for Ukraine and Russia is meeting tomorrow with the Polish president Andrzej Duda in Warsaw. Now this comes ahead of the Thursday meeting with President Zelenskyy.
Right,
and
Kyiv. He met today with NATO members in Brussels.
Well, now I'd like to talk about Poland. Right. So, what is the purpose of the meeting with the Polish president, and could possibly General Kellogg listen to the Polish side? Well, Poland has some objections regarding the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Well, the future territorial integrity of Ukraine, as we know that it is at risk, to say the least.
Well, I think the purpose of General Kellogg's visit is to listen and gather information from a variety of allies and from Ukraine. What is the situation? How do they see it? What do they see a good outcome to be? Where does this go from here? So that he can report back to President Trump, who's going to decide next steps once he hears from the team that met with the Russians, once he hears from General Kellogg on his meetings. He's already, I'm sure, heard from Hegseth, and we'll hear from Marco Rubio as well. This is, it's funny because people are saying, President Zelenskyy said, the U.S. doesn't have a plan. We thought they had a plan. They don't have a plan. There's no plan. And if we had a plan, people will complain that we developed a plan without them. And now instead, what we're doing is going around and consulting with people, and everyone's confused. Why are we consulting with people? So I think people need to relax a little bit and give this some time and a chance for a new administration to get its feet on the ground.
Lastly, President Zelenskyy wants to take Keith Kellogg to the front line. Now, what is he trying to achieve?
Oh, that's a great idea. That's a very important idea. When I served as special representative, the first thing I did was go to the front line, because you get an immediate personal appreciation of what people are going through. You see how the war is playing out. He's a general himself, so he has been in a lot of active duty command headquarters, and he's going to get a clear understanding of what's happening.
But could this somehow change his mind? Because clearly he has already an agenda that has been discussed with Donald Trump himself. So,
well, I mean, when you say change his mind, I mean, what is his mind? I mean, General Kellogg is a serious, seasoned, experienced general. He understands what Russia is. He understands what's happening in Ukraine. He is trying now to serve President Trump in a way that can get an end to the fighting in Ukraine. And then that will require some additional steps to make sure the fighting doesn't happen again. There's no resurgence of Russian attacks. So he needs to get all the information he can to see how that looks and make recommendations to the president.
Absolutely. So Kurt Volker, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine and negotiations under the previous Trump administration. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.